welcome to Gracefully Graying. I'm your host, attorney Henry Gornbein. Please watch this video and others on our YouTube channel, and also like and visit our Gracefully Graying website. Today on Gracefully Graying, I'm very pleased to welcome a friend who I've known for many, many years, well, not many, but several years, who is a reforming meteorologist, Chris Edwards. So Chris, welcome to Gracefully Graying as we discuss the important topic of climate change.
Thanks, Henry. It's great to talk to you again. I appreciate being invited and having a chance to chat. Yeah, I would say many years we've known each other and seen lots of things change, and I'm glad to have an opportunity to talk about climate change, which is all around us and seems to be getting more and more attention. And I think that's for very good reason.
It's an important issue. And first of all, tell our viewers a little bit about your background.
Well, briefly, I became interested in weather when I was about 5 years old. So there wasn't much doubt I was going to go into it as a career. I joined the Air Force as a weather forecaster. And then after serving in the Air Force for 4 years, I joined the Weather Channel during its first year during its infancy in the early 80s. And basically then moved into broadcast meteorology for the balance of my career. Most of my career was spent here in Metro Detroit, very happily, working for Channel 2 and Channel 7, where I broadcast the weather. And also I spent many of the years of my career as an environmental reporter. And that's how I got very interested. Actually, beginning in the late 80s, I got very interested in the issue of climate change and have been following it and reporting on it for many years since. I am a lifelong lover of the weather and about 35-year studier of climate change, and I've watched a lot of it happen in front of my eyes during my career.
That's for sure. What is weather, Chris?
Well, weather is a state of the atmosphere at any given place and time. It's, maybe sunny today or breezy today. That's what weather is.
What about climate?
And climate's different. It's the prevailing weather conditions over a long period of time, usually 30 years or longer. So the weather is something we have today. The climate is something that we talk about over a 30-year or longer time frame.
So what is climate change exactly then?
Well, climate change, broadly defined, Henry, is what is becoming different about that long-term climate that we have. And it's not just heat. It's not just greater heat. There, as we'll talk about, there are other elements of climate change, like more increased precipitation and that sort of thing. Particularly, the focus is on human-caused climate change or anthropogenic climate change. Climate has always changed, but in this case and at this point in history, the climate is changing very rapidly, and it's largely due to human activity, and especially the burning of fossil fuels.
Chris, why does it still get cold if it seems like things are getting warmer in many areas?
Well, I mean, it still gets cold because the climate is changing, but the climate still, for instance, here in Michigan, we have a relatively cold climate. We're pretty far north. The air masses from the polar regions can come down here pretty easily. So it still gets cold because even though the overall trend might be warming, we are still going to have cold days. And there's one other reason I want to bring up that's actually been studied pretty carefully over about the last 10 years. A lot of people have heard of the polar vortex. That's a band of winds around the Arctic that generally stays up there and keeps the very coldest Arctic air locked in the Arctic region. Well, one of the prevailing theories is that as we're changing the climate and changing the upper levels of the atmosphere as well, it's easier for that polar vortex to get knocked around a little bit, to get displaced, think of it. And when that happens, large sections of that huge cold polar air mass can break down and move farther south than they otherwise would. So kind of strangely, maybe counterintuitively, it happens that we can get unusually cold air masses, unusually cold outbreaks in this part of the world because of climate change. It happens more often because of climate change. Now, we might get colder than we have been before and then warm up to be warmer than we have been before. And that's one of the hallmarks of climate change as well, is greater variability. It isn't always just warming. It's hotter hots and sometimes colder colds, but with the overall pattern being toward warmer conditions.
Chris, what about the expectation of more freaky weather, for lack of a better word?
Well, it's a very appropriate word. And I think, Henry, we can expect more and more of the freaky weather. It's kind of what I was touching on before, talking about, and the models have been predicting this for over 40 years, that we would see more intense rainstorms, more intense snowstorms, stronger hurricanes. We would also have a tendency toward greater and longer duration droughts, as well as heat waves. So the weirdness of the weather is likely to increase as we move forward in a climate changed world. We've already seen that. We've already been able to document, for instance, in this part of the world, in North America, that we have more intense rainstorms than what we used to have. The rainiest day of the year in Metro Detroit is on average rainier than it was even 20 or 30 years ago. And obviously that causes us some problems when that happens with flooding.
Chris, what about more extreme local events occurring?
Yeah, I mean, the local events, whether it be a ferocious snowstorm, a ferociously heavy thunderstorm downpour, those are likely to happen more. Now, I don't want to suggest for a moment that those sorts of things didn't happen in the past. They did. We have, in this country, we have a pretty solid 140-year record of weather events. And believe me, in that time, there have been lots of very freaky events that didn't have anything to do with the change in climate. The point is that those sorts of events are becoming more common, and we can expect as we move forward in time, they will become even more common. So you might have heard sometimes, I can't believe it. This is our third 500-year flood in the last 10 years. Well, there's a reason for that, and part of that reason is because of the changing climate.
What about the impact of climate change on forest fire? And, you know, we talk about a forest fire season, especially in the far west, California, the Pacific, and parts of Nevada and Arizona. And it seems like it's getting more and more extreme.
It is. It truly is. 2020 was a horrendous year for forest fires, particularly in California. But as you mentioned, throughout a lot of the West, they had big trouble in Montana and Colorado as well. And unfortunately, that is partly linked to climate change as well on a twofold basis. As I mentioned earlier, drought becomes more likely as the atmosphere warms. So you're going to have you'll be more likely to have drought that involves less precipitation and for a longer duration. That has been expected, that's been predicted, and that is what's going on. That's not to say that the entire West is always in a drought these days, but it is more commonly in a drought situation. That's problem number one, and that's been documented over the last 75, 80 years that the drought conditions are increasing in the West. Unfortunately, a second problem is that the pine and mountain beetle has killed millions and millions of evergreens out in the western United States. And now we have millions of acres of dead trees that are in the forested areas of the West. And obviously that is fuel for a fire. So when a fire does start, I mean, they have always had forest fires in the West. Many of them are started naturally, often by lightning. They have always existed and will continue to. However, these dead trees are more fuel for the fire, so they can be more devastating than they used to be. And I have to tell you, part of the reason those trees died, the pine beetle used to get killed off. The larva of the pine beetle used to get killed off by intensely cold weather in the heart of winter. Those intensely cold temperatures aren't happening as often, so the larvae aren't killed off as often. So the beetle is able to do more devastation and has done that and killed all those, many of the trees out west over the last 20 or 30 years. So it's a twofold impact from climate change on the forest fire possibility and the devastation we've already seen out west.
Chris, what about the severity and frequency of hurricanes?
Well, that's been an area that has really been an intense focus of climate change scientists over the last 10 or 20 years. And frankly, there's a little less agreement in this particular area than there is in some of the other aspects of climate change impacts. But it's generally accepted now. Some scientists still have different opinions, but it's generally accepted that we can expect that we will have more intense hurricanes. You have hurricanes are driven largely by warm water. We're warming the water. We're also warming the air, and the warmer air is, the more water it can hold, the more water vapor it's able to hold. So those two things sort of make sense that you would potentially see more in the way of hurricanes. But it's not so much that we're going to see more hurricanes by number. It's that some hurricanes will be able to get more intense than what they were otherwise able to do. And we have seen those projections in the computer models, and we have seen some of that bear out, not just in the North American area where we had 7 major landfalling hurricanes in the 2020 season in North America, which did over $1 billion worth of damage. But we've got to remember, this is global climate change, and the entire world deals with hurricanes, typhoons, and so we're seeing more intense hurricanes and typhoons throughout the world. And the most recent research shows, interestingly, that hurricanes in a climate change environment are more likely to slow their forward speed and rapidly intensify. And that's not a good combination. If a storm rapidly intensifies as it approaches land and it slows its forward speed, it then is able to do more devastation for a longer period of time rather than a hurricane that just whips through there rather quickly. So we certainly have reason to be concerned about hurricanes vis-a-vis the climate change issue also.
Another question that just occurred to me, what about the impacts of climate change on tornadoes? We seem to be getting more severe tornadoes and more of them, unless I'm mistaken.
Well, it may seem that way. There is not, that I'm aware of, Henry, and I'm not familiar with everything that is out there in terms of the climate change, most recent research, but I'm not aware of anything that shows a really solid link between more frequent tornadoes or more intense tornadoes and climate change. You could make an argument, again, you warm the atmosphere, it holds more moisture. Moisture is a key driver for severe thunderstorm activity as well. So it sort of intuitively makes sense. I'm not aware of the research to that. I might just throw in this. You might have a sense that the tornadoes are more ferocious and more common because they are being reported much, much more frequently than they used to be. Let's think about it. Even 15, 20 years ago, we didn't all walk around with a videotaping device in our pocket. We do now. So it's much, much more likely that you're going to see a tornado that happens than you were even 15 or 20 years ago, much less 40, 50 years ago when they started forecasting tornadoes. So we need to be aware that some of the perception that we have may or may not be the reality of a change in the weather, but more a change in our ability to see and hear and report on those changes.
Chris, what about the severity of rain and snowstorms?
Well, there's little doubt that climate change drives more intense snowstorms and more intense rainstorms. Unfortunately, here in Michigan, we had a horrible evidence of that last May when the Edenville Dam collapsed up in the central part of the state. Now, clearly, that was partly an infrastructure issue, without a doubt, and we have a lot of infrastructure challenges in this country that we have to address because things have been ignored for a very long period of time, or at least neglected. But there's also no doubt that there was a very, very intense rainstorm thunderstorm prior to the collapse of that dam. And those sorts of things are happening more and more often in many parts of the country. And I think we can expect it to continue to happen. So between the fact that our infrastructure has been neglected and the fact that the storms are more intense, both in the summertime and the winter with the snowstorms, I think those two things combine to really put our focus on making sure that those sorts of things are addressed so that we minimize damage and most certainly that we prioritize, reducing or eliminating loss of life.
What about the impact of climate change on the Great Lakes region of our United States?
Well, that's a great one, Henry, because climate change is not going to affect all parts of the world equally. And obviously, I've spent a lot of time focused on what it means to the Great Lakes. A couple of things. First of all, we're going to see these more intense rainstorms, as I talked about. We're going to see occasionally more intense snowstorms, but we're also going to be more likely to enter into periods of drought where we don't get much rain, or we might have a winter with very, very little snow. We've just got to recognize that these, as you referred to it earlier, these freaky weather conditions are going to become more common than what they have in the past. Obviously, the Great Lakes region, we here in Michigan are blessed to be surrounded by these beautiful Great Lakes. What happens to them? Well, it's most likely, based on what the computer models are telling us as we move out 50 years and beyond, it's most likely that we're going to see more rapid changes in the levels of the lakes. Right now, the lakes are very high. They could more rapidly than we think reduce their levels and then come back up again in a period of just a few years, whereas in the past, those sorts of things tended to take a little bit longer. Again, I want to make clear, throughout the history of the Great Lakes, recent and even prehistoric, there's a lot of evidence that the Great Lakes go up and down in a natural way. And there will be natural variabilities that are overlaid on top of the changes that climate change is bringing. But in answer to your question, I think we're going to see the lakes go up and go down more quickly and more often than what they used to. We're going to see a tendency toward heavier downpours in thunderstorms. We're going to see a tendency toward more intense snowstorms. But overall, we're going to have a warmer condition, which means less time that the lakes are ice covered. When they're not ice covered as long, the water from them evaporates more readily, which leads to a reduction in the level of the lakes. There are a lot of computer models that over the long term seem to be tilting toward the lakes becoming lower in their levels as we move out in time. Again, there's variability that we're going to see, but I think we're also most likely to see, not a guarantee by any means, but most likely to see a general dropping of the levels of the lakes, in part because there'll be more evaporation in a warmer atmosphere, and some of the lake water that sits in the basin is going to go into the atmosphere through evaporation.
Chris, I recently read an article where they were talking about the Gulf Stream being impacted by climate change.
Yeah, I was able to catch that as well. There's some fascinating research on that. Basically, just to back up a little bit, the Gulf Stream is a warm current of water that mostly goes up the east coast of the United States. It flows from south to north, and then it hits Greenland. If you kind of picture a map in your mind, it hits Greenland and starts turning to the east. And it keeps some of those areas warmer than they would otherwise be because of the warm water. Now, what scientists have been seeing for many years now is this unusually cold and getting colder pool of water in the North Atlantic just south of Greenland. This phenomenon has a name, AMOC. It's the Atlantic Meridional Oceanic Current or something like that. But basically what they believe is happening is the increased melt of the glaciers that are on Greenland. That fresh water, cold water, is dumping into the North Atlantic. There's tremendous evidence that the glacier melt in Greenland is getting much more rapid. So it's making that water colder than what it used to be. Also, there's a difference in the salinity of fresh water versus salt water. So all those things just kind of combine to make the North Atlantic, where the Gulf Stream goes, it makes it a different environment than it used to be. Now, here's where it gets kind of fuzzy. What does that do to the Gulf Stream? We don't really know over the longer term what it's going to do to the Gulf Stream. We do know that the Gulf Stream is important for climates across all of the Northern Hemisphere, particularly in the North Atlantic Basin and over into Europe. And the Gulf Stream also has a lot to do with weather patterns, with driving storms and that sort of thing. So there is a lot of uncertainty, and it's the subject of a lot of research. It's going on. It's a big question mark. We don't know what exactly it's going to mean, but we expect it to continue to go on and probably to intensify because the mechanisms that are causing it are only going to continue to increase too, Henry.
Chris, what can we do to fight the increase of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere?
Well, I'm glad you asked, Henry, because some of these things can seem sort of daunting. We can all do something. We absolutely can all do something to reduce the carbon dioxide that we're putting into the atmosphere. A lot of focus about that, and obviously we are Motown, is to try to reduce the emissions, to try to reduce the carbon dioxide that we put in the air through transportation. The transportation is part of it. We also produce carbon dioxide in the energy that we use in our homes and in the factories that drive our economy in the local area. So what can an individual do? Do anything that you can. You can start by reducing your driving if you can do that. Drive a more fuel efficient car. Take fewer trips. Are these small things? They're relatively small things, but they're beginning of a change in attitude, and that's very important too. It's also important to become educated, as you're doing right now, to become educated about the issue, to follow the issue, to find out and listen to. A lot of companies all over the world are realizing that they've got to make changes here and do it quickly, and learn about those things and support those things, support the companies that are doing that, and support the people that are in the fight to make a difference for climate change. We can all do something about that by not only altering our personal behavior, but by learning about things and by supporting the people and agencies and issues that are making a difference in battling climate change, because it is not too late to make a difference.
Thinking of cars, the fact that now the major companies are really starting to go all in with regard to electric cars, will that make a difference?
It will make a difference. It absolutely will. Yeah. Is it going to happen overnight? No. But cars and trucks that burn fossil fuels are responsible for a huge part of the emissions. Again, in the vicinity of a third, maybe a little bit less than that. So, I mean, it's considerable. It will make a difference. It's one of the best things that we can do in terms of making a difference in fighting climate change. The electric cars and changing the fleets over from gasoline powered to electric is going to make a difference. It's a much cleaner energy if we do that. I just want to throw this in too, Henry, while I'm thinking about it. Another very easy thing that people can do is to plant trees. I mean, what is the old saying? The best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. The next best time is today. I mean, we may not be around to see those trees reach their full maturity, but that doesn't matter. Trees take a tremendous amount of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. They prevent as much storm runoff, which is an issue in increasing intensity storms. So planting trees is also a good idea, and that's not hard, and that doesn't have to be expensive either.
That's a good point. What are some recommendations for all of us to create some positive changes in our environment beyond what we've discussed so far?
Well, I often say, and we're doing it right here, I often say the first thing, well, okay, maybe the second. The first thing is to educate yourself a little bit, but everybody's doing that right now by watching this. The next thing is to talk to people about it. Let's talk about this. Just like there are a lot of difficult issues that we as a society face. This is not the only one. Let's talk to each other. Let's talk about climate change. Let's talk about let's not waste our time with, is this happening, blah, blah, blah. Let's talk about what we can do to make a difference. Talk to people of different ages, talk to people of different backgrounds, talk to people of different political persuasions. Let's all talk. And let's start by doing that and talking about what are you doing? I mean, the best thing, I don't want to sound overly simplistic, but the best thing that you can do to help with climate change is think, what am I good at? What am I good at? If you're good at making noise, make noise. If you're good at talking to people, talk to people. If you're good at cooking great meals for people that are out there organizing a march or putting together something to address a legislative issue, if you're good at cooking and you can feed those hungry stomachs, cook. Figure out what you're good at, and then figure out that this is a massive, massive issue with tons of different areas that can be addressed and need to be addressed over time, not a one day and out sort of thing. Match what you are passionate about, match what you are good with something that can make a difference. It may take a little time to find that exact perfect match, but I urge you to do it. And I really hope everybody understands, Henry, it is not too late. There is some change that is baked in the cake and we can't do anything about it. But there is also change that is going to depend greatly on where we go from here.
Thinking of other issues, what about plastic versus paper, for example, when you're in the grocery? I mean, is that something that can factor in?
Well, plastics in general are not going to be as environmentally friendly as paper would be. So in that particular case, I would probably opt for paper. I personally use reusable bags and wash them regularly, so I don't use plastic or paper. And a little thing that I also do is whenever I can, when I go to the grocery store, number one, I combine trips. I ride my bike to the grocery store. I take a lot of short little trips to the grocery store rather than tons of different things. I ride my bicycle for good exercise, to get some fresh air, and to help the environment.
Any other ideas that you have that you can share with our viewers? I'm going to ask for some takeaways, but we've got about 2 minutes left. So what are some things you can share with us?
Yeah, well, again, I think it's important that we recognize that climate change is real. We need to be past the point where we're saying, sometimes people ask me, even on the street, they will recognize me and they say, so do you believe in climate change? I don't even like the framing of the question, Henry. It's not a belief sort of a thing. I mean, belief is whether or not you believe in UFOs or something like that. I trust science. I believe in science. We have seen with COVID the amazing things in the last few months that science can do to save us from something, and we're on the path to doing that. I believe in science, and science is clear that this is happening, that it's human-induced, and that it's serious. We need to take it seriously. I believe in that. It is dangerous to us, but we all need to do what we can to, as I said before, begin by educating ourselves and then starting to make some kind of a difference. Talking to people, as I mentioned, is a big issue. Being involved, let's face it, this is partly political. Political decisions are made. They can be challenging. They can be divisive. But understanding what the choices are and what the implications are for the choices that we make in a political arena as well is very, very important. But I want to stress, some climate watchers have gotten discouraged over the last few years because we're not making the drastic changes we need to. I understand that being discouraged. We as individuals can't be too discouraged. We can make a difference.
We're out of time. Before we sign off, what are 5 takeaways to share with our viewers?
Well, let's see, 5 takeaways. Climate change is here. Climate change is happening, and it is a threat to our way of life and to the way of life of our children and our grandchildren. I think about my as yet unborn grandchildren. This is a danger to life as I want them to be able to live it. We all need to do what we can. It's not too late, and I guess if this is the 5th one, this is a good point in our lives to think about our legacy. And I know for me, I want part of my legacy to be the fact that I helped to recognize this and make a difference in any way that I could.
Chris, I want to thank you so much for being our guest on Gracefully Graying. I want to thank our viewers for Gracefully Graying. And again, please visit our YouTube channel and also go to Gracefully Graying to see this and all the other important videos and articles that we are constantly posting as we continue to grow. Again, thank you so much for being our guest on Gracefully Graying, Chris.
My pleasure. Thanks, Henry. I enjoyed chatting with you.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.